Thanks for tuning in to Healthy Planet One, where we discuss healthy living from experts in each of their fields. This is your host, Patricia Starr.
And your co-host, Kimberly Knox.
Today's guest on Healthy Planet One is Dr. George Rozelle, who is the owner of Mind Spa Integrative Healing Wellness Center. Welcome to our call, George. We are so happy to hear from you, and we'll be talking about You Can't Get Me Out of Your Mind was with the title that you gave me. Is that right?
That's correct.
Goodness. So I know that you have been working in the field of psychophysiology and biofeedback since 1990, and you are a licensed certified psychotherapist and board certified neurotherapist, and et cetera, right? So let's
it's all about studying the brain.
All about the brain. And so we're so honored to have you with us today. I'm going to let you kind of get us started on how you got started and, all the different things that you're involved with, and bring us up to the present moment. If you don't mind, go ahead.
Sure. Give you a little historical perspective. I started out as a psychotherapist and picked a tough field, addictions, and I got very frustrated, with the lack of success that was industry-wide. So I often felt like it was too much work to try to get through the verbal defenses and try to affect change. Then I discovered some research on doing alpha-theta brainwave training to treat alcoholism, and the initial clinical trials were very impressive. So I said that this is something I need to check out. It could be a better way. So I went to Menninger Clinic in Kansas, where they developed this protocol, got trained, came back to the treatment center I was in, and plucked a couple of volunteers out of the residential treatment group. And from the very first one, I started having amazing breakthroughs. So that got me excited about the potential of approaching this from the inside out rather than the outside in, and affecting changes in the brain. Had very good success with that, hitting about 20% success as opposed to 30%, and eventually evolved out of that into general private practice. I had an opportunity along the way to treat a colleague who had suffered a stroke, and he had gone through traditional medical treatment and rehab. They pronounced him medically stable, but still very much impaired. So I had learned enough at that point to do a brain map, and I was able to, which is a quantitative EEG recording, and it clearly showed the area where the stroke had occurred. And I was able to place electrodes on the skull over that area, record brain information, feed it back in such a way that we can encourage the brain to begin to rewire itself. Had very good success with that. I took him on as a single case study and had that report published in a peer-reviewed journal, making a initial contribution to the field, which was pretty exciting. But a lot of work. So I said, I don't want to do that again. I just want to be a clinician.
But it's very impressive
those
work.
Two experiences.
Yeah, very impressive.
Yeah. But those two experiences taught me you can take a brain that is really stuck in a behavioral pattern like addiction and get it unstuck so that we can overcome the blockages there. And you can take a brain that is severely damaged, and a stroke is very devastating, and get the brain to rewire. So I eventually then decided to embark on private practice and take on anybody, whoever came through the door. And I'd learned enough then to be able to examine the brain and know what the brain is supposed to be doing so I can apply neurofeedback to affect changes. And neurofeedback is essentially just a specialized form of biofeedback. It's EEG biofeedback, if you will. Biofeedback is a general term for placing sensors somewhere on the body, recording physiological information, and selectively feeding that information back to the individual in such a way that they can learn how to self-regulate. So you can take, for example, the autonomic nervous system, you can take processes that are normally thought to be unconscious and involuntary and make them conscious and voluntary. And then you can place the sensors on the scalp and record brain activity and feed that information back to the brain in such a way that the brain can begin to make changes. Otherwise, the brain is content to just maintain the status quo, even if that is less than optimal functioning. So we can nudge the brain to move in the right direction. And that, I've had tremendous success with that. I got into the field in its infancy, and I've grown up along with the whole field of neurofeedback, neurotherapy, and the technology is just skyrocketing. So it's a steep learning curve, but it's exciting to be able to keep up with current trends and try to stay on the cutting edge of this technology. So,
well, this is really huge. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm starting to ramble, so I'll take your questions.
Well, no, you're not rambling. There's so much because it feels like this is such a huge learning curve. The brain was considered, that's what you have and that's what you get, and but then they discovered neuroplasticity, which sounds like what you're actually you're reworking the brain. You're getting the brain to work in new ways and new directions, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we've learned how to tap into the brain's natural neuroplasticity, and we can direct it accordingly. Having said that, in my evolution in neurofeedback, I've kind of moved from more traditional operant conditioning model where we tell the brain what we want it to do based on our mapping, and then reward the brain for moving in that direction. And now I'm using a more passive post-electrical stimulation type of approach that trusts the brain to figure out how to reorganize itself. And it's a way of tapping into the wisdom of the brain. Is it knows what it's supposed to do. For various reasons it can get stuck, due to injury or illness or repetitive behavior patterns or whatever. And it will maintain that kind of equilibrium. But if we, can gently give it information that it needs to reorganize itself, it's very capable of doing that. I discovered that a few years ago. Yeah, I discovered that a few years ago doing research with retired NFL football players who had suffered the effects of repetitive head trauma, either the offensive lineman that bang heads on every play, or the wide receiver that takes the spectacular hit. They all sustain some damage to the brain, and over time they develop a lot of cognitive impairment, emotional issues, and loss of executive functioning, which is why many of them end up killing themselves. They just can't function anymore.
Well,
with this technology, I just described, in doing only that modality in 20 sessions, we saw significant symptom reduction and normalization of their brain maps. So that was very exciting. So I started doing that in my private practice, and that's like the main approach that I use. I still do the operant conditioning when the brain needs a little more guidance, and I add in other applications, which I call neuromodulation. Neuromodulation is a way of stimulating the brain without requiring input from the brain. So we can use pulse light and tap into the brain's natural frequency following response, and we can entrain the brain or we can present a complex random flash pattern and disentrain the brain. I also use near-infrared neuromodulation. The power of a particular wavelength of of infrared can penetrate into the neurons, into the mitochondria, and release important chemicals in the brain to encourage more growth. And I also use acoustical neuromodulation, which is using sound to affect the brain. We're working with my colleague, Dr. Lindenfeld, and we're doing exciting research on PTSD with combat veterans. And we're finding that we can get complete resolution of their PTSD in 2 to 4 sessions. And it's nice. They like it because they don't have to talk about their trauma. They just have to access it, which turns on that trigger switch in the brain. And then we match that with the sound frequency and then bring in competing frequency to disrupt that pattern. So those are a couple of exciting areas for me. I enjoy researching PTSD, and I enjoy researching head injury.
Oh, that's really good.
I know. General practice
I know that there was a great movie out called Concussion that talked about the damage to the brain, and I was so excited to see that, because I also work with some cranial work, and it's just like I couldn't believe it that it was such a powerful movie, but there was hardly anybody in the seats. I'm like, what? This is something that everybody knows. You're doing phenomenal work. And I know my co-host Kimberly has a question. Let me turn it over to her for a second. Go ahead, Kimberly.
Yeah, so this came up a few minutes ago, but you were on a roll, and definitely this is great news for our veterans. Exactly. I mean, relying on medication, but also I wanted to bring up a point that there's a lot of people that in years, they terminologize something as bipolar. A close family member of mine in Vermont has been dealing with this for years, doing the traditional route of being on medications after medications, and then having to go into electric shock therapy. And they won't listen to me on, changing food or diet. But this must be a better alternative also for people in these situations that don't really understand what bipolar is. A big catchphrase, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've treated a lot of bipolar patients with good success. It's basically an instability in the brain, and we can use neurofeedback to create a more stable environment in the brain and minimize the peaks and valleys, the shifts in the way the brain is functioning. And medication
even after electric
will
shock
suppress
therapy?
symptoms, but even after electric shock therapy,
Yes, good.
Hopefully, I can get to them before they get to that. But with depression, we see a brainwave asymmetry, a right-left frontal asymmetry in the brain, and we can balance that out, create better symmetry in the depression level. So it's all about, I think it's very important to examine the organ you're treating. So rather than, guessing, and a lot of times when medication is prescribed, it's a guess, it's a trial and error thing.
Yeah.
It was.
So we can map the brain and identify particularly what areas are stuck, and then we can target those areas and get the brain to repair itself.
Well, George, let me ask you: you don't deal with any drugs at all? It sounds like, because I'm not hearing that from what you're delivering today. Is that correct?
That's correct. I often see people that come here because they want to get off their medications. Mm-hmm. I am not an MD, so I try to work with the prescribing physician, mm-hmm. and the neurofeedback can actually change the need for the medication or render the medication not effective like it was before. But it can also remove a lot of the side effects that people are having. So it's also often important if people are on medication to have a med re-eval after a period of